If you like Star Trek and Star Wars and you like ship battles, you'll like this channel. And if you like what you see, please subscribe and make a comment. It helps. It really does. And with that being said, let's get started. So I've been giving a lot of thought about the Cardassian Federation border wars and how the Federation dealt with it. And I started thinking to myself, if I was in their position, what would I have done with the forces that were allowed to be in that battle? How would I have organized it? What kind of tactics would I have used? And so I want to show you guys how I would have dealt with the Cardassian threat if I was in charge of the fleet that was defending Federation borders against Cardassians during the border wars. Alright, so right at the bat, there's some things that I have to explain before we do this analysis. You will only be given ships that would be probably in, I would say, the 23rd century. So we're talking about Constitution class, Mirandas, Constellations, Excelsiors, Orbith, and then your biggest ship that you'd be allowed, or the newest ship, would be the Ambassador. Now, I do believe that there were some of the more modern starships were engaged in these border wars as well. But for my analysis, I'm going to try to make the most effective fleet composition and tactics using the most limited amount of resources possible. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so we know the Cardassian Galore was rolled out during this time period. It was used pretty heavily during this time period for these border wars, but we know that lots of other ships were still in service during this time and were not replaced at this time. And the reason the Galore took over the jobs of all the other ships is because of their lack of efficiency during this border war crisis. So we're going to take a look at some of these ships from Birth of the Federation and Star Trek Armada, and those are going to be our representation of some of the ships that we're going to see. So the old style ships that we're going to be seeing this time period would be Cardassian scout ships, such as the one seen before you. These are maneuverable, lightly armed, defensively. They're not very good. They would be just a cheap scout ship for scouting, trying to identify where forces are, things like that. So we see things like the Radolek class cruiser, which this may or may not be the correct class or the image, but it would be a medium-sized raider. It would have modern weapons, moderate shields. It wouldn't be able to go toe-to-toe with any Federation starship of any kind. But these ships would probably operate in groups of 3, typically trying to offset their limitations. Now, the next ship would be some of the Cardassian older cruisers. I think some of the older Cardassian cruisers, from my understanding, they are moderately well armed, but they are slow and they have not the best warp engines. Their sensors and targeting systems are inadequate, to say the least. But they do have a significant amount of firepower on them, so at close range or within spiral wave disruptor range, they could do serious damage. And then, in my opinion, the most advanced ship, we'd start seeing Galore Type 1s and possibly Galore Type 2s, but you would not see very many of them. Most of the Galores that you'd be seeing during the border wars would be Cardassian Galore 1s, which overall are a pretty decent ship. They have heavy armor, they have pretty far range, they do have a heavy spiral wave disruptor cannon. Now, I don't know if the Cardassians of this time period would even have heavy spiral wave disruptor cannons, but even if it just had a medium or it just had standard spiral wave disruptor cannons, those are still modern weapons and they are still dangerous. So I would consider this ship to be about a mid-level as far as actual threat. Though for the Cardassian military, this would probably be the best and the most suitable and well-armed starship. I personally don't think that this ship or the Type 1 Galores would have antimatter weapons really on them at this time period, because the Cardassians were struggling with resources. And I do think that some of their older generation starships, like the one we saw previously, I believe that they are using missiles and some other older weaponry, I guess is how I would say that. And they may have torpedoes on them too, but the Galors are typically stated not to have torpedo launchers on them. I know that in the future that changes. We know the Type 3 for sure has torpedo launchers, and the Galors that we see during the Dominion War obviously had torpedo launchers too, but for the border war skirmishes, I don't think they really had that. So now we need to talk about Cardassian technology. So during this time period, the best weapons they would be carrying would be spiral wave disruptors. So spiral wave disruptors are a pretty strong weapon. They do have far range, but the further range that they accelerate to, the less effective they become. So for an example, if you're attacking a ship from 200,000 kilometers, you can get hits in there, but you're going to lose a significant amount of power from your spiral wave disruptors. And spiral wave disruptor cannons are not at the same caliber as seen as some of the other weapons during this time period. Now, there are spiral wave disruptor cannons that are equivalent to Starfleet weapons, but for the most part, they're not. And so I really think that when it comes to weaponry, that the Cardassians are pretty heavily outgunned. And I really think that this really would be evident when we start talking about torpedo technology, because Cardassians are so far behind in torpedo technology at this point for two reasons. Number one, they don't have the technology. And number two, they don't have the resources to produce large amounts of antimatter. So they absolutely do have torpedo technology, but it's not as widespread and it's not as advanced as Federation. So for an example, would say an ambassador class could probably launch around 5 to 6 torpedoes at a Cardassian ship. The best that we're going to see from a Cardassian is a single shot torpedo launcher, which would be equivalent to what we see on like a Miranda or a Constellation. Or Constitution, I meant. So with that being said, the limitations of the Cardassian fleets also comes with their sensor systems. So their sub-sensors and sister systems are subpar compared to the Federation. So what this would mean is that the Federation sensors will definitely pick up the Cardassians coming before the Cardassians can pick up the Federation coming. But the Cardassians have worked around this by creating technologies that make it harder to sense their ships or see what's on them. They do have some different technologies unique to them that could compensate for this to a certain extent. For example, it's common technique for Cardassians to lay with their systems turned off, and since it's harder for sensors to pick up Cardassian ships just by the way what their hulls and stuff are made of, it's easier for them to surprise attack, or they'll be in areas where sensors can't scan or hiding in asteroid fields, and as soon as they have a ship come by, then they come out there and then they surprise attack them. Cardassians are well known for pulling these kind of stunts, and the Cardassians are a smart enemy. They're not really anything to take lightly. They may not have advanced technology, but they do have decent tactics, and they are a smart and dangerous adversary. Okay, so now with all that going on, we kind of have an understanding of the Cardassians. Let's talk about the fleet composition. So this is how I would do things. I would use ambassador class starships in the front line to soak up damage because they have the most amount of shields. In the rear section, I would have my Constellation class starships being my relay system. And I would bring in, for my support, I would bring nothing but Excelsior class starships. I wouldn't bother with Constellation. I wouldn't be using Mirandas. And I won't be using Constellation starships for actual engagement. The idea behind this is Oberth may or may not be something that you'd want to use in a scouting role because their sensor systems are not as good as a Constellation class, and their shields are subpar, and they're not as fast. So they would probably fall victim. And that's why I wouldn't use those. I know a lot of people like the idea of the Oberth as a science ship. I mean, it is a science ship, but it's not particularly a great scout ship. I don't know why I can't talk. Sorry, folks. But Constitution class, it does good on its own. It's used to being on its own. It has fantastic sensors, and it has good communication systems. So its communication systems and its sensors are actually better than an Excelsior. So, and the main reason is the Excelsior has more firepower, it's got a lot more torpedo tubes, and it's basically all around set up for defense, so it doesn't have as much utility for, let's say, secondary systems. So when I'm saying secondary systems, I'm talking about long-range sensors and things of that nature, where during this time period, the Constitution class starship's primary role isn't defense anymore. It's not considered a cruiser or even a heavy cruiser. It's pretty much just used for scouting now, and or taking cargo from one place to another place. It's much like the Miranda, except for the Miranda. That's another reason why I don't have the Miranda in here, is the Miranda doesn't have as good secondary systems as the Constitution class does. But with that being said, as far as firepower goes, it doesn't even have as much firepower as a Miranda. A Miranda, because of its mega phasers, and it technically has 2 torpedo launchers, but it really can act as 4 since it has forward and rear abilities with it being a torpedo module. But with that being said, this is why we're going to be using the Constitution class, substituting the Oberth out, and then we're going to keep some of those Constitution classes that have those better systems, those better sensors and stuff, and then those higher communication systems. We're going to use them as a mobile relay system. So remember, we're in the borderlands. This is the very edge of Federation territory, so we don't have great communication tools. We don't even have mobile satellites out there. We don't have a proper networking system. A lot of this stuff is just out there, nowhere land. So we need a good network system to allow our fleet to know where they're at and what they're doing. So I'm going to use these ships to do that because, number one, they can sense when ships are coming. They're going to be able to pick up those big fleets. They're going to be able to stay out of their sensor range. They're going to be able to watch them. And then they're going to be able to relay that information to one another. And then we can send that information to the fleet. Okay, so in engagements with large fleets, you're going to be outnumbered. And that's going to be obvious because you're fighting Cardassian territory here. And the Cardassians are the ones being the aggressor. So they're aware of the situation and of the technological differences between the Federation and the Cardassians. They're not truly aware of how big it is, but they know it is there. So they're going to send a pretty decent-sized fleet against you, and they're going to try to overwhelm you, because that's Cardassian tactics. So you're going to send the Constitution out. The Constitution is going to relay the information of an incoming fleet. Then he's going to send that information back to the fleet using this relay system of the other constitutions, or if you're desperate, Oberths. But I would be using constitutions. They would be in the middle of the fleet. There would be some in between. There would be like a 3-layer, right? And so once this gets related to the information, where the Cardassian fleet is, how big it is, then I would send my fleet, would then engage the Cardassian fleet, but we would stay out of range for an actual, firefight. We're going to only get into torpedo range, and if we can do that using our sensory systems, and we can catch the Cardassians off guard or even hit them while they're in warp, it doesn't matter. We want to attack that fleet and beat it down as much as possible. And if possible, hit it with just torpedoes, move away, come back, torpedo it again, move away, torpedo until we can just break down the fleet. We want to try to avoid, a straight-on gunfight with the Cardassians because they're outnumbering us. This is what I would do. And I would do this with move around with decent-sized fleets. I would not be roaming around in single ships or anything like that. And I would be primarily focusing on large Cardassian fleet groups. I want to take out their fleets fast and efficiently, and I want to have as little losses as possible so that I can demoralize the Cardassian troops. I want them to be demoralized knowing that they are completely outclassed. And not only are they being outclassed, they're being outclassed by an older generation fleet, which is kind of what the Starfleet was not willing to, for whatever reasons, engage with newer ships. I think they were trying to keep those secret because they didn't really know what the Cardassians had. And we kind of already know what the Cardassians have, so it's not really a fair analysis. But they didn't want to risk their newer ships in case they did have something really good, which they didn't, but they didn't know that. But since we have the ability of perception of time and future, we could obviously prepare a better fleet. And they had to have had some of an understanding of what the Cardassians have, so they could have used my strategy if they wanted to, and they may have used it to a certain extent. But the way it seemed to me is because of the vastness of this space and then trying to protect so many areas at once that fleets or groups were broken up in 3s and 4s. See, and I wouldn't do anything like that. I mean, I would have a fleet would have at least minimum 3 capital class ships, and then supported by light cruisers, which would be the Excelsior. I'd have a minimum of 4, and then as far as recon go, I would have at least 3 or 6 of the Constitution classes out there doing that. And if I was running low on ships, I would use the Miranda if I had to. I would not take Oberst into a conflict zone like this. I think that it would be absolutely foolish in any form or manner. But if I had to do this and I had to substitute the Constitutions with Mirandas, we might be able to pull it off with Mirandas. I don't think Miranda's subsystems are as good as the Constitution from what I've seen on the analysis of the ships, but it might be good enough compared to Cardassian technology to at least pull off this to a certain extent. So this is what I would do with the Cardassians. I would demoralize them by blowing them away with torpedoes, showing them that we don't even have to get in range to fight you, to defeat you. And hopefully, with so many large capital ship losses and main fleets destroyed, that the Cardassians would think about signing some kind of peace treaty or something along that lines, or just plain out giving up those border areas and pushing back into their space because they know that they're completely outclassed. I mean, either or I would go with it, because those colony states I don't really think are that valuable to the Federation, in my opinion. They're just a bunch of random people like living out in the forest is how I'm looking at it. So though they're supposed to protect them, they've kind of moved out there on their own, but it is Federation citizens, so we should be defending them. And if we're going to defend them, the best way, I think, is we can't always be there because there's not enough ships to be guarding them all the time. If we can show the Cardassians they're inferior and prove to them that dealing with us is going to be a death sentence, then you would have a lot more Cardassians acting like they are in Deep Space Nine, where they don't want to engage the Federation. They're avoiding conflict with the Federation as much as possible. That's the outcome I'm looking for. Then the other thing I would do, which the Federation didn't do, is I would honestly try to set up some kind of trading agreement or something like that with the Cardassians to try to make them somewhat dependent on Federation supplies, like, I don't know, replicators or something, in order to create some kind of economic connection to them that they wouldn't want to break, since the Cardassians suffer from resource depletion anyways. Maybe we could make them dependent on a resource after the battle. I wouldn't do that until after the battle, where they know they can't beat us, and then they become dependent on us as a way to subvert the society without actually escalating any more violence. That's how I would deal with the Cardassians, but I'd be curious what you would do.